Hey everyone, welcome to the course, and thank you for enrolling. So for anyone thinking of skipping this first section, just make sure you watch the very last video. I understand if you've taken another course, if you have read a book, you've done some React, and you don't need to understand the basics at this point. Just make sure you watch that last video and you download the included download. It includes all of the code, the slides, the solutions, the starter files, the handouts for the entire course. And along with that, I would watch the video, not just click the link, because there are specific instructions on how to run the slides and the handouts. They are not static PDFs. They're actual websites that you can open up and interact with. So make sure you watch that video. It's really important stuff. I've been getting a lot of questions about this from people who are skipping the first section. So I decided to redo this section and add in a little note up front. Anyway, on with the section. So what are we talking about? Well, we have a couple goals in this first section. We're going to talk about what React is, the history, the goals. Is it a framework? Is it a library? A pretty common debate around React. We're going to get into components, the most important, basically the only building block in React. We'll talk about function components versus class components. We'll play with a real component that I've written for you. You'll be able to tweak some values and see what happens. And then you'll write your own first component, both as a class and as a function. So that's where we're going. And then after we set the stage in this intro section, we'll dive into JSX and props and state and create React app. And eventually we'll get to things like hooks and context and reducers. There's a lot to talk about. So let's get started. Alrighty, so let's talk about React. First up, what is it? Well, it is a front-end framework / library. We will talk about that distinction and the debate behind it in the next video. For now, let's just call it framework / library. It's extremely popular these days. In 2019, it eclipsed all of its main competitors to become the most commonly used front-end framework / library, beating things like Angular and Vue, Ember. There's a bunch of them out there. So we'll talk more about that in the next video. Also of note is that Facebook developed and actively sponsors React. It is an ongoing project, and that's worth mentioning because React's probably not going to disappear or go away anytime soon. It has a somewhat successful company backing it. If we go to their homepage here, reactjs.org, the one-line description is that React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. There's that word library. React does refer to itself as a library, but there's more to the story. Okay, so what does it actually do other than being a framework / library? Well, the main point of React is to build something called components. Components are reusable pieces of JavaScript logic plus HTML plus CSS usually that are combined into one modular component, one piece of an application that you can then use to build or compose a larger application. So React apps consist of a ton of small components that are then combined and built up, composed into larger pieces until we have an entire app. So we're going to talk more about components, but here's a diagram that I like to show when I'm talking about React. Typically, at least in the past, when I was teaching, I would talk a lot about the separation of concerns. When you're creating an application, you want to have your JavaScript separate from your CSS. You want your CSS separate from your HTML. Each thing is its own entity, and they interact the least amount possible. Well, when we talk about React, we're writing these components that take HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and combine them into one piece, one component. So there still is a separation of concerns. It's just been sort of flipped on its head. If you look at this diagram, we have a button component, for example. A button component combines all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript logic to make a single button that we can add to an application. There might be a date picker, a modal, a list, whatever these components are. We'll see a bunch of examples. They take HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they combine them together into one piece. So React is the tool that helps us build these components. We can build a component for a color picker, or for a to-do item, or for a loading spinner, or a nav bar, a slide-out drawer. Whatever our components are, React is what helps us structure them. It's what packages them up, puts a nice bow on top, and makes them reusable. So it is a structure that we build components within. We use the syntax, the tools that React provides to build these components. So before we dive into writing our own components and looking at existing, more complex components, The next video is going to address the library/framework question. If you do not care whatsoever about that question, it probably won't make much of a difference to how you learn React or if you should learn it. But if you want to know more about that debate, you can watch the next video. Otherwise, skip it and we'll jump right to components. Okay. All right, welcome back. So next, I want to quickly address a really common question or discussion that I've seen on the Q&A boards for this course. The question is React a library or a framework? Where does it fit in compared to other tools? So let's talk about front-end frameworks first in general. Frameworks are larger than a typical library. So something like Moment.js, which is a date and time library for JavaScript, you can incorporate that into your code at will. You write your application, and then you can use Moment.js and plug it into your app. A framework works a bit differently. Usually you take the framework and you plug your code into the framework. You follow its rules. These frameworks give you structure. They provide a blueprint or a framework for your application, which makes it a lot faster for you to write code, but also it gives you a little less freedom. You have to follow certain rules. Sometimes you need to name your files a particular way or put them in a particular place. You have to embrace the full framework to get the most out of it. So these frameworks are opinionated. They have opinions or views built in as far as how you should design an app, how it should be structured, and how it should work. So when we talk about front-end frameworks, I'm talking about client-side JavaScript frameworks that help you make single-page apps usually. So they provide a way to reuse your code. They provide a way of writing templates with HTML. And there's a lot of them out there. This is a very small subset, some of the more popular ones today, but there are dozens and dozens that are relatively popular. But the big ones are Angular, Vue, Ember, and then I put React here with a question mark because React doesn't quite follow the same pattern as something like Angular. If we look at the homepage for Angular, angular.io, first of all, they call it a framework. That's different than React, which referred to itself as a library. Angular does a lot more for you out of the box. So if we go to features, there's a ton of features listed here. Things like templating, there's a command line interface out of the box, testing is included, animations, there's a client-side router. Angular is really an ecosystem that you live and breathe if you're writing an Angular application. React, on the other hand, is a lot lighter weight. React really does one thing on its own. It helps you make components. It's a way of creating individual components and then combining them together to make larger applications. So React on its own, just React, is less feature-rich. I don't want to say less powerful, but it does less for you out of the box. However, when people write large React apps, most developers are using other React-specific tools alongside React. So things like React Router, Redux, there's a whole bunch of these tools out there that are sort of standard. There's almost a standardized stack for developing React. So you can use React as a standalone library. But in my opinion, once you start incorporating the other tools like React Router into your workflow, it becomes more like a framework. So it's almost like React is a choose your own framework. You can use React on its own, like a library, very lightweight and simple, or you can take React and combine it with other tools that are commonly used alongside React to build something equivalent to what Angular does for you. So there's not a straight yes or no answer. You can read all sorts of blog posts and YouTube videos and Stack Overflow questions about whether React is a library or a framework. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter much. What I like about it is that you can use just React. It's lightweight and simple, but if you want a more full-featured framework, you can go and grab the commonly used tools and combine them all together. Also, at the end of this course, we'll see an actual framework that calls itself a framework called Next.js, which is built around React. So you still write React components, but Next.js is much, much more opinionated. It tells you, you need to put your files in this particular folder in order for them to do this one thing. It gives you a lot more of a structure to work inside of. Anyway, so that's the end of this video. I don't know if that was helpful or just more confusing. Honestly, it doesn't really matter because a lot of people love React. You're probably learning React because you know that people like it. People are hiring for React developers. It's very commonly used. And part of the reason it's loved and so commonly used is that it doesn't force you to do everything the React way. It doesn't force you to use some router out of the box or some animation solution out of the box. If you want them, you can go and grab them. But if you just want React, you can use it on its own. Okay. So next, we're going to dive into components. We're going to see our first couple components.